HOA Karen thought shutting off an elderly woman's electricity during a deadly heat wave was just another enforcement decision, but she had no idea that within hours the entire neighborhood would be surrounded by ambulances, and everything she believed about control and authority would start collapsing in real time. It was one of the hottest weeks of the year when the incident began, with temperatures limning dangerously high across the entire neighborhood, and most residents staying indoors trying to avoid the suffocating heat. But inside a small house at the end of the street, an elderly woman was already struggling because her medical condition made extreme temperatures especially risky, and she relied heavily on electricity to keep her cooling system running properly. The problem started when HOA Karen decided that the woman's property had violations that needed immediate enforcement. She had been issuing warnings for weeks about unpaid fees and alleged compliance issues. But what made this situation different was that instead of waiting for a proper legal process, she chose to take direct action and ordered the electricity to the home be shut off without fully considering the condition outside or the health risks involved. At first, no one realized what had happened until neighbors noticed the elderly woman sitting outside her home, looking confused and weak, fanning herself with slow tired movements while trying to stay in whatever shade she could find. Several residents approached her and were shocked when she explained that her electricity had suddenly stopped working, and she had no idea why, because she had never missed any critical medical payments and believed everything was in order. Word quickly spread through the neighborhood, and it didn't take long before people started pointing toward the HOA office, where Karen had been seen earlier that day coordinating calls and making complaints about enforcement action against multiple homes. But what she didn't anticipate was how quickly the situation would escalate once residents understood that someone vulnerable had been left without power during extreme heat. As the hours passed, the woman's condition began to worsen. Concerned neighbors tried calling emergency services while also attempting to reach the HOA for clarification, but communication was slow and confusing, and by the time the situation became fully understood, the heat had already taken a serious toll, and panic started spreading through the community as people realized how dangerous the situation had become. And then the sound of sirens broke through the heat-filled silence as multiple ambulances turned into the neighborhood, responding to an emergency that no one expected to escalate this far. And as neighbors gathered outside watching the scene unfold, all eyes slowly turned toward the HOA office, because everyone now wanted the same answer: how did something like this happen, and who made the decision that led to it? The moment the ambulances entered the street, everything in the neighborhood shifted from confusion to full panic as paramedics rushed toward the small house at the end of the road where the elderly woman was now barely able to stand, and neighbors stepped aside, helplessly watching the medical team take control of a situation that had escalated far beyond anything anyone had expected that morning. Inside the home, the heat was overwhelming even for the responders, and they immediately began cooling measures while checking her vital signs, which were dangerously unstable due to prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures without proper ventilation or air conditioning. And as oxygen support was prepared, one of the paramedics quietly asked how long the power had been off, because the answer would determine just how critical the situation had become outside the house. Neighbors were gathered in tense silence when the truth started coming together piece by piece through fragmented conversations and phone calls. It became clear that the electricity shut off had not been a technical fault or utility issue, but an enforcement action connected to HOA Karen's orders. And as soon as that information spread through the crowd, the atmosphere changed instantly from concern to outrage. Several residents immediately began confronting HOA representatives who arrived at the scene, trying to understand what was happening. But they quickly realized the situation had spiraled beyond their control, because what had been treated as a routine compliance action was now being viewed as a life-threatening incident involving an elderly resident during a severe heat wave, and every minute that passed made the situation look worse. Investigators and emergency coordinators began documenting the timeline. They asked for records, emails, and authorization logs, and that is when the inconsistencies started appearing, because the decision to shut off power had bypassed standard safety review procedures and had been executed without proper verification of medical dependency status or environmental risk assessment, which should have been mandatory given the extreme weather conditions. When HOA Karen arrived at the scene later, she tried to explain her actions as standard enforcement protocol, but the crowd was no longer interested in explanations because residents were focused on the consequences, not the intentions. And what had made the situation even more serious was that multiple neighbors had already provided statements confirming that warnings about the elderly woman's medical condition had been raised previously but ignored during enforcement discussions inside the ambulance. The elderly woman was finally stabilized after emergency cooling treatment and gradual rehydration, but doctors made it clear that the situation had come dangerously close to becoming fatal and that even a slight delay in response could have led to irreversible damage, which immediately intensified scrutiny on how and why the power shutdown was approved in the first place. As news of the incident spread beyond the neighborhood, local authorities began reviewing HOA procedures and communication records, while residents demanded accountability and transparency from leadership. Meetings were scheduled, emergency hearings were called, and pressure mounted on the HOA board as more details emerged, showing that this was not an isolated decision, but part of a broader pattern of aggressive enforcement without adequate safeguards. Meanwhile, the safeguards community itself began to fracture as some residents defended procedural authority, while others argued that no rule or violation could justify endangering a human life, especially during extreme weather conditions. And the argument shifted from property enforcement to moral responsibility, with emotions running extremely high at every meeting that followed. In the middle of all this, the elderly woman's condition slowly improved in hospital care, and neighbors began organizing support for her recovery, bringing food assistance, medical help, and emotional support, which created a very different image of the same community that only hours earlier had been filled with sirens, panic, and confusion. The HOA leadership eventually announced an internal investigation and temporary suspension of enforcement actions related to utilities. But by then the damage was already done, not just physically but reputation, because trust in the system had been severely broken, and residents were no longer willing to accept decisions without oversight or accountability. And as for HOA Karen, the incident followed her long after that day, because what was once seen as strict enforcement was now being questioned as reckless decision-making that ignored basic human safety, and the neighborhood would never look at HOA authority the same way again. In the end, the heat wave passed, but the lesson remained permanently burned into the community that rules without compassion and enforcement without responsibility can turn a simple decision into a life-changing consequence. And sometimes the real emergency is not the weather outside, but the choices made inside the system itself.